The Purple Heart defense. The fluorescent lights of courtroom 7B cast harsh shadows across the worn wooden benches as Sergeant First Class Marcus Thompson sat rigidly in the defendant's chair, his weathered hands gripping a small velvet box. Inside that box lay his Purple Heart, earned 3 years ago in the mountains of Afghanistan when an IED blast had torn through his convoy, leaving him with a shattered leg, damaged spine, and fragments of shrapnel that would remain embedded in his body for the rest of his life. The medal had been presented to him in a sterile hospital room at Walter Reed, with his wife Sarah holding his hand and tears streaming down both their faces. The general who pinned it to his hospital gown had spoken about sacrifice, about honor, about the debt that America owed to its wounded warriors. Marcus had believed those words then, had clung to them during the long months of recovery that followed. Now, sitting in this courtroom facing federal fraud charges, those words felt like echoes from another lifetime. Judge Patricia Hawthorne adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at the case file before her. 23 years on the bench had shown her every kind of criminal, every sob story, every excuse. She had seen white-collar executives who had embezzled millions, drug dealers who had destroyed communities, and violent criminals who had shown no remorse for their actions. But something about the man sitting before her gave her pause. His military bearing was unmistakable, the straight back despite what appeared to be considerable pain, the way his eyes focused straight ahead with the 1,000-yard stare she had seen in her own son after his return from Iraq, the respectful nod he'd given her when entering the courtroom. Patricia Hawthorne had not always been sympathetic to veterans' issues. Early in her career, she had seen military service as just another job, no more deserving of special consideration than any other profession. That had changed when her son Michael enlisted in the Marines after 9/11 against her wishes and despite having a full scholarship to law school. She had watched him transform from a carefree college student into a hardened warrior, had seen him deploy twice to Iraq and come home each time a little more distant, a little more haunted. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way he jumped at sudden sounds. She had learned to recognize the invisible wounds of war, even when the VA seemed determined to ignore them. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice carrying the authority of decades in the judicial system, "you stand accused of defrauding the United States government of $50,000 through false claims and forged documentation. How do you plead?" Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The courtroom was packed. Unusual for a fraud case, but word had gotten out that a decorated war hero was being prosecuted. Local news cameras lined the back wall, and he could feel the weight of their lenses on him like the crosshairs of a sniper scope. In the front row he could see Sarah, her face pale but determined, flanked by his former squad members who had driven hundreds of miles to be here. Behind them sat other veterans, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, but with the same bearing that marked them as members of the Brotherhood that only those who had served could truly understand. The media attention had been building for weeks. The local newspaper had run a series of articles about his case, painting him alternately as a fallen hero and a common criminal. Veterans organizations had split on whether to support him or distance themselves from his actions. The American Legion had issued a statement saying that, while they sympathized with his struggles, they could not condone fraud. The veterans of foreign wars had been more supportive, with their national commander calling for a full investigation into the VA's handling of his case. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of something deeper, not defiance, but a quiet resignation that spoke of battles already lost. "I plead not guilty to the charges as they stand." The phrase, "as they stand," had been carefully chosen by his attorney. It was a subtle signal that while Marcus might not dispute the facts of what he had done, he disputed the characterization of those actions as criminal fraud. It was a distinction that would prove crucial as the case unfolded. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh stood up, her perfectly pressed suit and confident demeanor a stark contrast to the defendant's simple button-down shirt and the slight tremor in his hands that he was trying so hard to hide. At 32, Walsh was the youngest prosecutor in the district attorney's office, and this case represented her chance to make a name for herself. She had built her career on high-profile prosecutions, and a decorated veteran committing fraud was exactly the kind of case that could catapult her into the major leagues of criminal law. Walsh had grown up in privilege, the daughter of a federal judge and a corporate attorney. She had attended elite schools, graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School, and had never wanted for anything in her life. The concept of desperation, of being forced to choose between following the law and surviving, was as foreign to her as the surface of Mars. In her worldview, the law was absolute, and circumstances were merely excuses that criminals used to justify their actions. "Your Honor," Walsh began, opening her leather portfolio with practiced precision, "the evidence will show that Mr. Thompson systematically defrauded multiple government agencies, creating false medical claims, forging doctors' signatures, and manipulating the system designed to help our veterans. The defendant may have served his country with distinction, but that service does not place him above the law. In fact, it makes his crimes all the more reprehensible, as he has violated the very oath he swore to uphold when he enlisted." She clicked a remote, and a large screen descended from the ceiling, displaying a series of documents. The presentation had been meticulously prepared, with each piece of evidence arranged to build a damning narrative of systematic deception. "These are medical bills totaling $50,000 that Mr. Thompson submitted for reimbursement. Bills for treatments that, according to our investigation, were either unnecessary, inflated, or in some cases, completely fabricated." The documents on the screen told a story of bureaucratic complexity that would have been overwhelming to anyone not familiar with the labyrinthine world of military medical care. There were claim forms with altered dates, doctor signatures that didn't match the originals on file, and procedure codes that had been changed to reflect covered treatments rather than the experimental therapies that had actually been provided. Marcus's attorney, David Chen, a public defender who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Chen was a good lawyer, but he was overworked and underpaid, handling dozens of cases simultaneously. He'd been assigned this case 3 weeks ago and had barely had time to review the evidence, let alone develop a comprehensive defense strategy. The prosecution had built what appeared to be an airtight case, complete with paper trails, witness testimony, and expert analysis from forensic accountants who had traced every dollar of the allegedly fraudulent claims. Chen had tried to convince Marcus to take a plea deal, 5 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole in 3. It was a generous offer, considering the severity of the charges, but Marcus had refused. "I won't plead guilty to being a criminal," he had told Chen during their last meeting. "What I did was wrong, but it wasn't criminal. There's a difference." Judge Hawthorne studied the documents on the screen, then looked back at Marcus. Something in his eyes caught her attention, not the shifty, guilty look she'd seen in countless defendants, but something else. Pain, yes, but also a kind of desperate dignity, like a man who had made an impossible choice and was prepared to face the consequences. It reminded her of the look she had seen in her son's eyes when he had told her about the things he had been forced to do in Iraq, the moral compromises that war had demanded of him. "Mr. Chen," she said, "does your client wish to make any statement before we proceed?" Chen started to shake his head. It was almost always a mistake for defendants to speak before the prosecution had presented its case, but Marcus placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Your Honor, if I may." Judge Hawthorne nodded, and Marcus slowly stood, his left leg clearly causing him significant discomfort. The purple heart box remained clutched in his right hand, and she noticed that his knuckles were white from gripping it so tightly. "Your Honor, 3 years ago I was serving my 3rd tour in Afghanistan. I was a squad leader, responsible for 12 good men, boys really, most of them barely old enough to drink legally back home." His voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the silent courtroom. "We were on a routine patrol in Helmand Province when our convoy hit an IED. The blast flipped our Humvee, killed my driver instantly, and left me trapped under 2 tons of burning metal." The memory was as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. Marcus could still smell the acrid smoke, still feel the searing heat of the flames, still hear the screams of his wounded soldiers. Private First Class Danny Rodriguez, just 19 years old with a baby daughter he had never met, had been driving the lead vehicle. The explosion had killed him instantly, but not before he had managed to radio their position to the rest of the convoy. It was Rodriguez's final act of service, ensuring that his brothers in arms would know where to find them. Private Rodriguez. He was 19, had a baby girl he'd never met. He pulled me out of that wreckage. Saved my life." Marcus's voice caught slightly as he corrected himself. "I'm sorry, Your Honor. Rodriguez was killed in the blast. It was Corporal Jenkins who pulled me out. Sometimes the memories, they get mixed up." The admission of confusion was telling. Judge Hawthorne had read about traumatic brain injuries in veterans, about how blast concussions could affect memory and cognitive function. She made a mental note to ask about this later. Marcus continued, his voice steadier now. "The explosion had driven shrapnel into my spine, shattered my left leg in 14 places, and caused what the doctors called significant neurological damage. But I was alive, and I was coming home." He paused, and for a moment the only sound in the courtroom was the soft hum of the air conditioning system. In that silence, everyone present could feel the weight of what he was describing, not just the physical trauma, but the psychological impact of surviving when others hadn't, the guilt that came with being pulled from wreckage while your friends lay dead beside you. "The medevac helicopter arrived within 20 minutes, Marcus said, his eyes focused on something beyond the courtroom walls. "The medics worked on me for the entire flight to Bagram. I was conscious for most of it, and I remember thinking that I needed to stay awake, that if I fell asleep I might not wake up. I kept asking about my men, about Rodriguez and Jenkins and the others. The medic kept telling me to stay calm, to focus on breathing, but all I could think about was whether I had failed them." Ada Walsh shifted impatiently in her chair. She'd heard sob stories before, and while this one was admittedly more dramatic than most, it didn't change the facts of the case. Fraud was fraud, regardless of how the perpetrator had been injured. She was already planning her cross-examination, the questions she would ask to expose the holes in his story, the inconsistencies that would prove he was just another criminal trying to manipulate the system. But the spectators in the gallery were hanging on every word. Many of them were veterans themselves, and they recognized the authenticity in Marcus's account. The details were too specific, too painful to be fabricated. The way he described the smell of burning fuel mixed with blood, the sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the chaos, the feeling of helplessness as he was carried away from his fallen comrades. These were the memories that haunted every combat veteran, the experiences that bound them together in a brotherhood that civilians could never fully understand. Marcus continued, his grip tightening on the Purple Heart box. "When I got back to the States, the Army doctors did what they could. 3 surgeries on my leg, 2 on my spine. They gave me this," he held up the box, "and told me I was a hero. They also gave me a medical discharge, a disability rating of 70%, and a promise that the government would take care of me." The ceremony had been held at Walter Reed Medical Center, in a room filled with other wounded warriors and their families. The general who presented the medals had spoken eloquently about sacrifice and service, about the debt that America owed to its wounded veterans. Marcus had felt proud in that moment, honored to be recognized for his service. The Purple Heart represented not just his own sacrifice, but the sacrifice of every soldier who had served alongside him, including those who hadn't made it home. "For the first year, everything worked like it was supposed to," Marcus said, and Judge Hawthorne could hear the wistfulness in his voice, the longing for a time when the system had actually functioned as promised. "The VA covered my medications, my physical therapy, my follow-up surgeries. I was getting better, slowly but surely. I even started thinking about what I might do with the rest of my life. Maybe teach, maybe work with other veterans. I had hope." That first year had been difficult but manageable. The pain was constant but controlled with medication. The nightmares came regularly, but the VA psychiatrist had assured him that they would fade with time. Sarah had been endlessly patient, helping him navigate the bureaucracy, driving him to appointments, celebrating small victories like the first time he walked without crutches. They had even talked about starting a family, about the possibility of a future that extended beyond his injuries. He sat back down, the movement clearly painful. Then, the letters started coming. Claim denied. Treatment not covered. Seek alternative provider. The medications that were keeping me functional, not pain-free, Your Honor, just functional enough to get out of bed in the morning, suddenly weren't covered anymore. The physical therapy that was helping me walk without a cane was deemed unnecessary. The specialist who understood my particular injuries was out of network. The change had been gradual at first, then sudden and devastating. Budget cuts at the VA had led to stricter guidelines for treatment approval. Medications that had been routinely covered were suddenly classified as experimental. Physical therapy sessions were limited to a specific number per year, regardless of the patient's needs. Specialists who had been treating veterans for years were dropped from the approved provider list without warning. Marcus had tried to understand the reasoning behind these changes, had spent hours on the phone with VA representatives who seemed as confused as he was. The explanations were always the same: budget constraints, new guidelines, the need to ensure that taxpayer money was being spent responsibly. But to Marcus, it felt like a betrayal of the promises that had been made to him when he was lying in that hospital bed, broken but hopeful. Ada Walsh stood up. "Your Honor, while Mr. Thompson's medical history is certainly tragic, it doesn't excuse—" "Sit down, Ms. Walsh," Judge Hawthorne said sharply. "Mr. Thompson, please continue." The rebuke was unusual for Judge Hawthorne, who typically maintained strict control over her courtroom proceedings. But something about Marcus's testimony was affecting her in ways she hadn't expected. Perhaps it was the memory of her own son's struggles with the VA system, or perhaps it was simply the recognition of genuine suffering in a system that was supposed to heal rather than harm. Marcus nodded gratefully. "I tried to work within the system, Your Honor. I filed appeals. I went to different doctors. I filled out forms until my hands cramped. But the pain was getting worse, not better. The shrapnel in my spine was shifting, causing nerve damage that made it feel like someone was running electricity through my legs 24 hours a day. And the nightmares." He trailed off, staring at something only he could see. The nightmares had been the worst part. Every night, he would relive the explosion, would see Rodriguez's face in the moment before the IED detonated, would feel the heat of the flames and the weight of the metal pinning him down. He would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, with Sarah holding him and whispering that he was safe, that he was home. But home didn't feel safe anymore. Nothing felt safe. I wasn't sleeping, couldn't concentrate, started having what the doctors called episodes, flashbacks where I'd think I was back in that burning Humvee or back in the firefight that followed. My wife, Sarah, she tried to help, but I was becoming someone she didn't recognize, someone I didn't recognize. Sarah, sitting in the front row, wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to her husband describe the darkest period of their marriage. She had watched the man she loved disappear a little more each day, replaced by someone who was angry, paranoid, and increasingly isolated. She had tried everything: therapy, support groups, medication, but nothing seemed to help. The VA psychiatrist had told her that Marcus's symptoms were within normal parameters for someone with his injuries, and that she should adjust her expectations about his recovery. The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes, caught up in the raw honesty of Marcus's testimony. Judge Hawthorne found herself thinking about her own son, about the nights she had lain awake worrying about him, about the phone calls that had become increasingly rare and increasingly strained. She had tried to help him navigate the VA system when he returned from Iraq, but the bureaucracy had been overwhelming, even for someone with her legal background. The breaking point came 18 months ago. I was at the grocery store with Sarah, just trying to buy food for dinner, when a car backfired in the parking lot. The sound, it was exactly like the crack of an AK-47. Before I knew what was happening, I had tackled Sarah to the ground and was screaming for everyone to take cover. When I came back to myself, there were 20 people staring at me like I was some kind of dangerous animal. The incident had been humiliating and terrifying. Marcus had found himself on the asphalt of a suburban parking lot, his wife beneath him, both of them scraped and bleeding, while strangers looked on in shock and fear. Someone had called the police, and Marcus had spent the next hour trying to explain to officers who clearly didn't understand what had happened. Sarah had been understanding as always, but he could see the fear in her eyes. Not fear of him, but fear for him, fear of what he was becoming. Marcus's voice broke slightly, and he took a moment to compose himself. That night, Sarah sat me down and told me she was scared. Not of me, she said, but for me. She said I was disappearing a little more each day, and she didn't know how to help me come back. The conversation had lasted until dawn. Sarah had been brutally honest about what she was seeing, the way he jumped at sudden sounds, the way he scanned every room for exits, the way he had stopped talking about the future. She had told him that she loved him, that she would never leave him, but that she was watching him die a slow death, and she didn't know how to stop it. Judge Hawthorne found herself thinking about her own son, who had served 2 tours in Iraq and had come home changed in ways she was still trying to understand. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way he jumped at sudden sounds. She recognized all of it in Marcus's description. Michael had been lucky in a way. His injuries had been primarily psychological, and he had eventually found a therapist who understood combat trauma. But she knew that many veterans weren't so fortunate. I went back to the VA the next day, Marcus continued, told them I needed help, real help, not just more forms to fill out. The doctor I saw was young, probably younger than some of the soldiers I'd led in Afghanistan. He looked at my file for maybe 5 minutes, then told me that my symptoms were within normal parameters for someone with my injury profile, and that I should try to manage my expectations. The young doctor had been well-meaning but overwhelmed. The VA clinic was understaffed and overbooked, with doctors seeing dozens of patients each day. There was no time for the kind of comprehensive evaluation that Marcus needed, no resources for the intensive treatment that might have helped him. The doctor had increased his pain medication dosage and scheduled a follow-up appointment for 6 months later. It was the best he could do within the constraints of the system, but it wasn't nearly enough. Ada Walsh was growing visibly frustrated. This wasn't how fraud cases were supposed to go. The defendant was supposed to make excuses, not deliver what amounted to a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She could see the jury. Wait, this was a bench trial, but she could see the spectators in the gallery, hanging on every word. She needed to regain control of the narrative, to remind everyone that regardless of Marcus's circumstances, he had committed a serious crime. That's when I met Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, Marcus said, and for the first time since he'd started speaking, there was a note of something approaching hope in his voice. She wasn't a VA doctor. She ran a private practice specializing in combat trauma. A friend of mine, another veteran, had been seeing her and told me she was different. She actually listened. Dr. Morrison had been recommended by Tommy Kowalski, a Marine who had served in Fallujah, and had been struggling with many of the same issues as Marcus. Tommy had been skeptical of civilian doctors, convinced that no one who hadn't served could understand what they were going through. But Dr. Morrison had changed his mind. She had spent years working with veterans, had studied the latest research on combat trauma, and had developed treatment protocols that went far beyond what the VA was offering. He shifted in his chair, trying to find a position that didn't send shooting pains down his leg. Dr. Morrison spent 3 hours with me in that first appointment. 3 hours. She examined my medical records, my x-rays, my psychological evaluations. She asked me about my service, about my family, about what I wanted my life to look like. And then she told me something no other doctor had. She said I could get better, but it was going to take time, and it was going to take treatments that the VA wasn't currently approving. The appointment had been unlike anything Marcus had experienced in the medical system. Doctor Morrison had listened to his entire story without interrupting, had asked detailed questions about his symptoms and their progression, and had explained the complex relationship between physical and psychological trauma. She had treated him not as a case number or a collection of symptoms, but as a human being whose life had been shattered and who deserved to be whole again. Judge Hawthorne looked down at the case file in front of her. She could see where this was heading, and despite her years of judicial experience, she felt her heart beginning to race. The law was clear about fraud, but the circumstances Marcus was describing raised questions that went far beyond the simple facts of the case. Dr. Morrison explained that my case was complicated because I had both physical and psychological trauma that were feeding off each other. The chronic pain was making my PTSD worse, and the PTSD was making me more sensitive to pain. She said I needed a comprehensive treatment approach, specialized physical therapy, experimental pain management techniques, and intensive psychological counseling. The treatment plan that Dr. Morrison had outlined was comprehensive and expensive. It included cutting-edge physical therapy techniques designed specifically for blast injuries, experimental pain management procedures that used targeted nerve blocks and electrical stimulation, and intensive psychological counseling that combined traditional therapy with newer approaches like EMDR and neurofeedback. It was exactly the kind of integrated, patient-centered care that the VA claimed to provide, but rarely delivered. Marcus looked directly at Judge Hawthorne, and she could see the desperation that had driven him to this moment. She also told me that none of it would be covered by the VA. The treatments I needed were too new, too experimental, too expensive. But she said that if I was willing to pay out of pocket, she could help me get my life back. The cost had been staggering, nearly $50,000 for the full treatment program. It was more money than Marcus and Sarah had ever seen, more than they could possibly afford on his disability payments and her part-time salary. But Dr. Morrison had been confident that the treatments would work, and Marcus had been desperate enough to try anything. "Your Honor," Ada Walsh interjected, "this is all very moving, but it doesn't change the fact that—" "Ms. Walsh," Judge Hawthorne said, her voice carrying a warning, "you'll have your chance to present your case." "Mr. Thompson, what happened next?" Marcus took a deep breath. "I didn't have $50,000, Your Honor. Sarah and I had been living on my disability payments and her part-time job at the local library. We had maybe $3,000 in savings, but Dr. Morrison said she'd work with me, set up a payment plan, whatever it took. The financial strain had been immediate and overwhelming. Marcus's disability payments were barely enough to cover their basic living expenses, and Sarah's job at the library paid minimum wage. They had already been struggling to make ends meet, and the prospect of taking on such massive debt was terrifying. But the alternative, watching Marcus continue to deteriorate, was even more frightening. He opened the Purple Heart box and stared down at the medal inside. The purple ribbon was slightly faded, and the gold profile of George Washington seemed to be looking back at him with understanding. "I started the treatments. The physical therapy was unlike anything I'd experienced, not just exercises, but techniques designed specifically for combat injuries. The pain management involved procedures that the VA had never even heard of, and the counseling. Dr. Morrison helped me understand that what I was experiencing wasn't weakness or failure, but a normal response to abnormal circumstances. The transformation had been gradual but remarkable. The specialized physical therapy had targeted the specific muscle groups and nerve pathways affected by his injuries, using techniques that were based on the latest research in rehabilitation medicine. The pain management procedures had provided relief that he hadn't experienced since before his injury, and the psychological counseling had helped him process the trauma of his combat experience in ways that traditional therapy had never achieved. For the first time since he'd started speaking, Marcus smiled slightly. "After 6 months, I was walking without a cane. After a year, I was sleeping through the night. Sarah said I was starting to look like the man she'd married again. I was even thinking about going back to school, maybe becoming a counselor myself to help other veterans." Sarah nodded from the gallery, remembering those hopeful months when it had seemed like they were getting their lives back. Marcus had started laughing again, had begun making plans for the future, had even talked about the possibility of having children. The nightmares had become less frequent, and when they did occur, he was able to calm himself down without her help. It had felt like a miracle. The smile faded. But the bills were mounting. Even with Dr. Morrison's payment plan, I owed more money than I could possibly pay, and that's when I made the decision that brought me here today. The debt had grown to nearly $40,000, with interest and fees adding to the principal each month. Marcus had tried to find additional work, but his disabilities made most jobs impossible. Sarah had looked for full-time employment, but the only positions available would have required her to work evenings and weekends, leaving Marcus alone during his most vulnerable times. They had considered bankruptcy, but that would have meant stopping the treatments that were saving Marcus's life. Judge Hawthorne leaned back in her chair, dreading what she was about to hear, but knowing she needed to hear it. "I started submitting claims to the VA for treatments I'd received from Dr. Morrison, but I modified the documentation to make it look like the treatments had been provided by VA-approved doctors for VA-approved conditions. I forged signatures, altered dates, changed procedure codes. I told myself I wasn't stealing. I was just getting the government to pay for treatments that they should have been covering all along. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Marcus had just confessed to exactly what he was accused of, but somehow Judge Hawthorne found herself feeling not satisfaction at a criminal's confession, but a deep, aching sadness for a system that had failed one of its own. The process had been surprisingly easy. The VA's billing system was complex and understaffed, with claims processors who rarely questioned documentation that appeared to be in order. Marcus had studied the system carefully, learning which procedure codes were automatically approved, which doctors' signatures were on file, and how to modify dates and descriptions to make experimental treatments appear to be standard care. I knew what I was doing was wrong, Marcus continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Every time I submitted a false claim, every time I forged a signature, I knew I was violating the law. But I also knew that without those treatments, I was going to lose everything, my health, my marriage, my sanity. I was drowning, Your Honor, and those treatments were the only life preserver I could reach. The fraud had continued for over a year, with Marcus submitting false claims totaling nearly $50,000. He had been careful to spread the claims across different time periods and different types of treatments, trying to avoid detection. But the VA's Fraud Investigation Unit had eventually noticed the pattern, and Marcus had been arrested on a Tuesday morning while he was at a follow-up appointment with Dr. Morrison. Ada Walsh stood up, sensing her moment. Your Honor, Mr. Thompson has just admitted to systematic fraud against the United States government. While his personal circumstances may be sympathetic, the law is clear. He knowingly and willfully submitted false claims, forged official documents, and stole $50,000 from taxpayers. The prosecution requests that he be sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed under federal fraud statutes. Walsh's argument was legally sound. Marcus had indeed committed the crimes he was accused of, and the evidence was overwhelming. Under federal sentencing guidelines, he was facing up to 10 years in prison and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines. The fact that he was a veteran might be considered a mitigating factor, but it wouldn't excuse his actions. Judge Hawthorne looked at the young prosecutor, then back at Marcus, who was sitting quietly with his hands folded, the Purple Heart box resting on the table in front of him. She had presided over thousands of cases, had seen every kind of criminal and every kind of crime. But this felt different. This felt like a failure of the system itself, not just the actions of one desperate man. Mr. Chen, she said to the public defender, do you have anything to add on behalf of your client? David Chen stood up slowly, clearly struggling with how to proceed. He had handled hundreds of criminal cases, but none quite like this one. The facts were not in dispute. Marcus had committed fraud. But the circumstances surrounding that fraud raised questions that went far beyond the scope of a typical criminal trial. Your Honor, my client has been completely honest with this court about his actions. He's not asking for sympathy or special treatment because of his military service. He's simply asking for understanding. The system that was supposed to take care of him failed, and he made a desperate choice to get the help he needed to survive. Chen pulled out a folder and approached the bench. Your Honor, I'd like to submit some additional evidence for your consideration. These are letters from Dr. Morrison detailing Mr. Thompson's treatment and progress, testimonials from other veterans who have worked with Dr. Morrison, and documentation showing that the treatments Mr. Thompson received are now being studied by the VA for potential inclusion in their standard care protocols. Judge Hawthorne accepted the folder and began reading. The first document was a letter from Dr. Morrison, written in clear clinical language that nonetheless conveyed deep respect and affection for her patient. Sergeant Thompson came to me in a state of severe physical and psychological distress. His VA treatment had focused primarily on pain management through medication, with little attention paid to the underlying causes of his condition or the interconnected nature of his physical and mental health challenges. Through our work together, he has made remarkable progress, not just in managing his symptoms, but in reclaiming his sense of purpose and identity. The treatments he received were not experimental or unnecessary. They were essential for his recovery and his ability to function as a productive member of society. The letter went on to detail the specific treatments that Marcus had received, explaining the scientific basis for each intervention, and documenting his progress over the course of treatment. Dr. Morrison had included before and after assessments that showed dramatic improvements in Marcus's pain levels, mobility, sleep quality, and psychological functioning. The next several pages contained similar testimonials from other veterans, all describing Dr. Morrison's work as life-changing, all expressing frustration with the VA's limited treatment options. One letter was from Tommy Kowalski, the Marine who had first recommended Dr. Morrison to Marcus. "Before I started seeing Dr. Morrison, I was ready to eat my gun. The VA had me on so many medications that I couldn't think straight, but I was still having nightmares every night and panic attacks every day. Dr. Morrison saved my life, plain and simple. The treatments she provided weren't covered by the VA, but they worked when nothing else had. If Marcus Thompson is a criminal for trying to get the same help that saved my life, then the system is more broken than I thought." The final document was a research paper showing that the VA was indeed beginning to study and implement some of the same treatment protocols that Dr. Morrison had been using. The paper, published in the Journal of Veterans Affairs Medicine, acknowledged that traditional approaches to combat trauma had been inadequate and called for the development of more comprehensive, integrated treatment programs. Judge Hawthorne set the folder down and looked out at the packed courtroom. She could see veterans in the gallery, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes but with the same bearing as Marcus. She could see family members, reporters, and curious citizens who had come to witness what they thought would be a simple fraud case. But this was anything but simple. The legal precedent was clear. Fraud was fraud, regardless of the circumstances. But Judge Hawthorne had not spent 23 years on the bench without learning that sometimes the law and justice pointed in different directions. This was one of those times. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "I want to ask you a direct question, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you believe what you did was right?" Marcus stood up again, his movement still painful but somehow more dignified than before. He had been dreading this question, knowing that his answer would define not just how he was sentenced, but how he would live with himself for the rest of his life. "No, Your Honor, I don't. What I did was illegal, and I knew it was illegal when I did it. I violated the trust that the American people place in their veterans, and I violated my own oath to serve with honor and integrity." He paused, looking down at his Purple Heart. "But I also don't regret it, because those treatments saved my life. Not just my physical life, but my life as a husband, as a potential father, as a human being who could contribute something positive to the world. The man who walked into Dr. Morrison's office 2 years ago was dying, slowly but surely. The man standing before you today has hope for the future." The honesty of his answer was striking. Marcus wasn't trying to justify his actions or claim that they were morally right. He was simply acknowledging the impossible choice he had faced and the decision he had made. It was the kind of moral complexity that the law struggled to address, the gray area between right and wrong that existed in the real world but not in legal statutes. Judge Hawthorne felt something she rarely experienced in her courtroom, genuine uncertainty about what justice looked like in this case. The law was clear. Marcus had committed fraud, and fraud carried specific penalties. But the spirit of justice, the reason laws existed in the first place, seemed to point in a different direction. "Ms. Walsh," she said, "I want to ask you something as well. In your investigation of this case, did you look into why Mr. Thompson's treatments weren't covered by the VA?" Ada Walsh looked uncomfortable for the first time since the hearing began. She had focused her investigation on proving that fraud had occurred, not on understanding why it had been necessary. The question of VA coverage was, in her mind, irrelevant to the criminal charges. "Your Honor, the VA's coverage decisions aren't really relevant to the fraud charges. Mr. Thompson could have appealed those decisions through proper channels." "But did you look into it?" Judge Hawthorne pressed. Walsh shuffled through her papers, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the questioning. We did some preliminary research. It appears that the treatments Mr. Thompson received are considered experimental by VA standards, though there is some evidence that they may be effective for certain types of combat trauma." "And how long does the VA appeals process typically take for experimental treatments?" I'm not sure, Your Honor. Several months, possibly years. The admission was damaging to the prosecution's case. If the appeals process took years, and if Marcus's condition was deteriorating rapidly, then the choice between following proper channels and getting immediate treatment became much more stark. Judge Hawthorne nodded slowly. Mr. Thompson, during the time you were receiving treatment from Dr. Morrison, did you attempt to work with the VA to get coverage for these treatments? Yes, Your Honor. I filed 3 separate appeals, provided all the documentation, Doctor. Morrison gave me, even had her write letters explaining why the treatments were necessary. The last response I received said that my case would be reviewed again in 18 to 24 months. And how long had you been waiting at that point? 14 months, Your Honor. The timeline was devastating. Marcus had been waiting over a year for the VA to review his case, with no guarantee that the treatments would ever be approved. Meanwhile, his condition had been deteriorating, his marriage had been suffering, and his mental health had been spiraling downward. The choice between waiting for bureaucratic approval and getting immediate help had been no choice at all. Judge Hawthorne closed her eyes for a moment, thinking about her son, about the other veterans she knew, about the promises made to young men and women who volunteered to serve their country. When she opened them again, she looked directly at Marcus. Mr. Thompson, I want you to understand something. What you did was wrong. The law exists for a reason, and no one, not even decorated veterans, is above that law. If I were to simply dismiss these charges, it would send a message that fraud is acceptable as long as the perpetrator has a sympathetic story. Marcus nodded, his face resigned. He had known this moment would come, had prepared himself for it during the long months leading up to the trial. He had made peace with the possibility of prison, had even written letters to Sarah to be opened on their anniversary for the next 10 years, just in case. However, Judge Hawthorne continued, and the word hung in the air like a lifeline, justice is not just about punishment. It's about making things right, about addressing the underlying causes of crime, and about preventing future harm to both individuals and society. She stood up, and the entire courtroom rose with her. The moment felt ceremonial, as if something larger than a simple criminal case was being decided. Mr. Thompson, I am going to sentence you to 5 years of probation, during which time you will perform 500 hours of community service working with other veterans who are struggling with the VA system. You will also be required to pay restitution to the government in the amount of $50,000. ADA Walsh started to object, but Judge Hawthorne held up her hand. However, I'm suspending the restitution requirement pending a full investigation by this court into the VA's handling of Mr. Thompson's case and similar cases. If that investigation finds that the VA failed to provide adequate care or failed to process appeals in a timely manner, the restitution requirement will be waived. The courtroom erupted in murmurs of surprise and approval. This was not the outcome that anyone had expected, least of all Marcus, who was staring at Judge Hawthorne in disbelief. She looked out at the packed courtroom, then back at Marcus. Furthermore, I am ordering that a copy of this case file, including all testimony and evidence, be forwarded to the House and Senate Veterans Affairs Committees, along with a recommendation that they investigate the gap between the care our veterans need and the care they're receiving. Marcus was staring at her in disbelief, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the defendant's table. Sarah was crying openly in the front row, and several of the veterans in the gallery were wiping their eyes. Judge Hawthorne wasn't finished. Mr. Thompson, you served your country with honor and distinction. You were wounded in that service, and when you came home, the system that was supposed to take care of you failed. That failure doesn't excuse your actions, but it does explain them, and it demands a response that goes beyond simple punishment. She picked up her gavel, then set it down again without using it. I want to say something to everyone in this courtroom, and to anyone who might hear about this case. We ask our young men and women to go to the most dangerous places on earth, to face unimaginable horrors, to sacrifice their bodies and their peace of mind for our freedom and security. When they come home broken, we have a sacred obligation to fix them, not just to manage their symptoms or process their paperwork, but to give them back their lives. Her voice was rising now, filled with a passion that surprised even her. Mr. Thompson committed a crime, yes, But the greater crime is a system that forces our veterans to choose between following the law and getting the care they need to survive. That ends today, at least in this courtroom. She finally picked up her gavel. This court is adjourned. The sound of the gavel echoed through the silent courtroom, followed immediately by an explosion of voices as reporters rushed to file their stories and spectators tried to process what they had just witnessed. But Marcus heard none of it. He was staring at Judge Hawthorne, tears streaming down his face, clutching his Purple Heart like a talisman. Sarah, who had been sitting in the front row throughout the entire proceeding, rushed to his side and wrapped her arms around him. "It's over," she whispered. "It's finally over." But Marcus knew it wasn't over. It was just beginning. As he looked around the courtroom at the other veterans who had come to support him, at the reporters who would tell his story to the world, at Judge Hawthorne, who was gathering her papers with the satisfied look of someone who had done the right thing, he realized that his fight had just taken on a new dimension. He had come into this courtroom as a criminal, a veteran who had betrayed the trust placed in him. He was leaving as something else, a symbol of a broken system, a catalyst for change, a reminder that sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is to demand that your country live up to its promises. The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind of media attention and political activity. Marcus's story was picked up by national news outlets, and he found himself testifying before congressional committees, speaking at veterans events, and working with advocacy groups to push for reform of the VA system. The investigation that Judge Hawthorne had ordered revealed systemic problems with the VA's handling of experimental treatments and appeals processes. Hundreds of veterans had been waiting months or years for approval of treatments that could have dramatically improved their quality of life. The bureaucratic delays weren't just inconvenient, they were literally life-threatening for veterans who were struggling with severe physical and psychological trauma. 3 months after the trial, Marcus testified before the House Veterans Affairs Committee. The hearing room was packed with veterans, family members, and advocates who had come to support his call for reform. Marcus wore his dress uniform for the occasion, with his Purple Heart prominently displayed among his other decorations. "Honorable members of Congress," he began, his voice steady and clear, "I stand before you today not as a hero, but as a veteran who was failed by the system that was supposed to care for him. I committed a crime, and I accept responsibility for that crime. But I also want you to understand why that crime was necessary, and what we can do to ensure that no other veteran faces the same impossible choice." He went on to detail the specific problems he had encountered with the VA system, the delays in processing appeals, the arbitrary denial of effective treatments, the lack of coordination between physical and mental health services. He spoke about other veterans he had met who were struggling with similar issues, and he presented a series of recommendations for reform that had been developed by veterans' advocacy groups. The committee members listened intently, asking detailed questions about his experience and the proposed reforms. Several of them were veterans themselves, and they understood the frustration and desperation that had driven Marcus to commit fraud. By the end of the hearing, there was bipartisan support for legislation that would streamline the appeals process, expand coverage for experimental treatments, and improve coordination of care for veterans with complex injuries. 6 months after the trial, the VA announced new protocols for handling experimental treatments for combat trauma. The new guidelines would allow for faster approval of promising treatments, expanded coverage for integrated care approaches, and better coordination between VA and private providers. Dr. Morrison's treatment methods were among the first to be approved under the new protocols. A year after the trial, Marcus received a letter from the VA informing him that his original appeals had finally been approved and that the treatments he had received from Dr. Morrison would be retroactively covered. The letter included a check for $50,000, the exact amount he had fraudulently claimed. The irony was not lost on him, but perhaps the most meaningful outcome of the trial was the impact it had on other veterans. Marcus's community service work had connected him with dozens of veterans who were struggling with the VA system, and he had been able to help many of them navigate the bureaucracy and get the care they needed. He had also worked with Dr. Morrison to establish a non-profit organization that provided grants to veterans who needed experimental treatments that weren't yet covered by the VA. 2 years after the trial, Marcus and Sarah welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Hope. As he held his newborn daughter in the same hospital where he had received his Purple Heart, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The fraud charges had been the lowest point of his life, but they had also been the catalyst for changes that would help thousands of other veterans. The Purple Heart still sat on his dresser at home, a reminder of his service and sacrifice. But now it was joined by other symbols, letters from veterans he had helped, photos from congressional hearings, and a small framed copy of the legislation that had been passed as a result of his case. The medal that had once represented only his wounds now represented something more: the ongoing fight to ensure that America kept its promises to those who served. As he looked down at his sleeping daughter, Marcus thought about the future he wanted to build for her, a future where veterans were treated with the respect and care they deserved, where the system worked for those who had sacrificed for their country, where no one would have to choose between following the law and getting the help they needed to survive. The war in Afghanistan was over for Marcus Thompson, but his mission continued. And for the first time in years, he was confident that it was a mission he could complete with honor,